back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this episode, I have a discussion with John Dangelo of the Anti-War War Vet. After the last episode with Zach Johnson, who also has some military experience, I recognize that I wanted to get some different angles from somebody who had combat experience. So I talked with John today. Whereas the discussion with Zach focused a lot more on maybe the theological, spiritual aspects, the conversation with John today got a lot more practical. And one of the things that you're going to hear repeated in this episode by John is kind of an emphasis on, even though he's a Christian, recognizing the need for what Gary Habermas would call like a minimal facts approach. This idea that we are going to talk to secular people and atheists, and we can meet on the common ground. I don't have to sell them on the image of God to have a lot of the same common ground and discussion as to why the state should be abolished. Now, as Christians, we can certainly go a lot deeper than that and have those discussions, but we don't need to evoke Christianity in order to make some arguments with those who are secular. So like I said, this episode is going to end up being a lot more practical, and I think you'll find it a good complement to our discussion with Zach.
Yeah, so my name is John Dangelo, and I am the author behind the now pretty inactive blog, Anti-War War Vet. I have an Instagram page that I kind of still lurk on, but I don't post much to anymore. And I became pretty involved with libertarianism sort of broadly about 10, 12 years ago. I had gotten back from Afghanistan in 2012, and sort of during my time there with the Marine Corps as a truck driver, I became... I always hesitate to say disillusioned, but a little disappointed with the mission and sort of our standing there, and drove me to read a bit about the history of the war and American foreign policy broadly. And that kind of led me to an anti-war position. I met my wife shortly after. I was an atheist, or maybe like a default atheist, and then became a Christian in a church that she had brought me to. And I kind of found a way to bring those two positions together. I tried to do it in the most intellectually honest way possible, trying to honor scripture and what I thought to be the most important political philosophy that I had come across, which was voluntarism or anarchy. And I kind of found that there was a lot of overlap between, especially the early Christian church, and what I was reading Jesus to be commanding his followers to do and to live like, and how to interact with power and how to interface with government, and what I was reading in my Mises.org resource list. And so I kind of ended up here, where I was bomb throwing with memes on Instagram for a little while, and then found that probably wasn't the most productive way to go about things, and probably wasn't putting my best Christian foot forward, which is so easy to do online. And so now I'm just focused on fatherhood and reading and learning, and yeah, I do these podcasts now and then too, just to kind of chat with people. I think I answered your question. Is that?
Yeah, that's good. I suppose the fatherhood thing is probably a part of why you've let your site lapse, huh?
Yeah. It's really hard to be making some ridiculous meme with a toddlers clawing at your phone and wanting to see. So I felt like that probably was not the best use of my time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I know that you can find your story on a number of other sites as well. So I think that was a good synopsis to kind of get us up to speed of your really quick history. But one of the things that's interesting, which I remember hearing it now, but when you said it, it kind of clicked for me for real, where you were an atheist when you came to a nonviolent position, which is interesting. Because I know that there are quite a lot of like secular humanists and stuff who kind of take the nonviolent position, and sometimes it seems harder to actually get Christians to be nonviolent than it is to get secularists to be nonviolent, which I find kind of ironic. So I wonder if you'd be nonviolent if you came to Christianity first.
I took a nonviolent. I still grapple a bit with pacifism. I mean, I think it's the highest ideal. I think it's crucial to a Christian life. But as a father yourself, I think you can agree that the tension between like providing a safe environment for your family and the prospect of violent interaction, even if you're not choosing it, is always kind of a tricky one in my mind. But that being said, I came to a nonviolent state position, and ultimately, I don't know which came first. An isolationist foreign policy is something that I thought was important, or what we should be doing as a government that in the United States, or a posture of nonviolence for the state in general. But ultimately, I arrived at both of those conclusions, and that was really just because of like a pragmatic, from a pragmatic angle. I don't see American foreign policy as really the bill of goods that it's sold as. And I think if the more people spend time with thinking about what's been going on, especially the global war on terror is such an easy entrant into skepticism for American foreign policy choices. But it's futile. It's often counterproductive, and the product of those poor decisions or malicious decisions, depending on how you look at it or who's the actor, is the worst possible thing in the world, which is the taking of human life, often at a grand scale and in violent ways and in such a banal, bureaucratic way, which makes it so much more disturbing to me. So it was easy once I started learning about it to reject it. And now it's just kind of a question of what my rejection actually means and how I can turn that into something tangible for good.
Okay, so that's helpful. Anti-war is different than nonviolent or pacifist.
Yeah, I'd say.
Okay.
What do you? Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah, I don't want to.
No, I can see that. I understand. Yeah, when you divvy out violence to the state to do violence as it sees fit for a variety of purposes, as opposed to imminent danger to yourself. I think those are two different things. Yeah.
Right. And I think it's a good place to start for the secular mind too. It's not, you don't have to talk about the sanctity of human life or the universals of Christendom to make the case that like war is an objective bad, or something that we should try to avoid at all costs. And here's the reasons why hitting a school bus full of kids with a drone bomb is unjust.
Yeah. So I like the term that you used, and I want to jump off of that. You use the term, you weren't satisfied with the bill of goods that you were being sold. And I mean, that's a part of my story too, which is you start learning real American history, the off script stuff. And the more you learn, it's just insane. what's in our past and present. So in terms of the bill of goods, right? So I assume you came from a similar background to me. Like, do you have like conservative influences?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
My mom was, I grew up in a single mom household. We lived with my grandmother for a long time, and they're definitely right leaning, but I think my mom is, much like my wife, the position I respect a great deal, which is um, thoughtful removal from the entire political sphere. Like my mom doesn't want to talk politics or care much for politics, which was definitely part of my upbringing too, which I think makes it easier because I didn't come from a tribe ideologically. I came from a, you know, uh, more or less like middle of the road, right leaning suburban um, household. And, we were nominally Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. And then we kind of fell away from the church because it was hard for her to do logistically. And then I think those were, important seeds for my foundation. But, I never had much impressed upon me.
Yeah. So, okay, correct me if this is wrong about your upbringing, but for me, I viewed the military and police as kind of people who kind of got my freedom for me. Whereas as now I realize that certain groups of people don't see the police or the military that way because of their history with them or interactions with them. So. You with your military background, and now being an anarchist, like how would you start a conversation with somebody who kind of views things as we probably did growing up, like the military and the police get my freedoms and they, they protect me and they're, building this, this mythology of America, our greatness. Like, how do you kind of pull back the curtain a little bit? Like, what's your first step?
So I come from a military family, and a lot of the Marines that I had deployed with ended up becoming cops, turning into cops. And so I still have like this. I've heard it referred to, I think, by Scott Horton, but I really like the term like Boy Scout patriotism. Like I really do love the sort of cartoonish version of American history and the American founding, and with that, like I appreciate the spirit of the like really corny, sheepdog sort of thing. Like I think any functional society has people who do stand as like a vanguard against foreign aggression or internal aggression, crime, whatever. So I have a great deal of sympathy for police and the military as an institution. But if I'm talking to someone, I try to lay that groundwork early that I'm not coming from it as the Chaz Chop, Molotov cocktail thrower. I don't hate police, and I think just like that Hannah Arendt banality of evil thing I was mentioning earlier, I do think that they're often victims of circumstance from a moral perspective. I think they're in often untenable positions and think they're doing something good and have a difficult time being introspective and thinking that maybe this isn't the greatest thing. So I try to make that clear, and then I try to just talk about the costs financially and then in life of our current regime of foreign policy decisions. So the war in Ukraine is a perfect example. I hear a lot of hand waving and disregarding of the choices of NATO expansion in the following the fall of the Soviet Union, and people try to disregard that as primary motivator for the Putin regime. And I mean, I have no idea, but it seems a logical enough conclusion from the expansion of NATO so far east that Russia would feel threatened by that. Now, that doesn't excuse the decision to kill a bunch of people in Ukraine, but it puts us, you and I, or I suppose you being abroad, maybe even more so, but being in the contiguous United States, I'm at legitimate existential risk from nuclear holocaust because of choices that I have no say in, which feels very undemocratic to me. And the global war on terror and all the issues of blowback, the expansion of Al Qaeda from a group of a couple hundred zealous farmers to a global organization of tens of thousands, all can be drawn directly back to American choices, American government choices to intervene in the various wars in the Middle East, and their relationship with Saudi Arabia. So I try to make those points just to make it clear that this isn't some ephemeral thing that I like to think about. I'm some would-be philosopher. This is tangible. The attacks on 9/11 took 2,000 plus American lives and, moms and dads away from their families and so on. And it did that not just because Al Qaeda hates us for our freedoms, and the choices that these people in power make are putting us at risk. And I think that that's a good starting point for a lot of people. And it's, I just finished my taxes last week. I did them a little late. It comes at a significant financial cost to each of us, and we don't think about that enough. But your dollars, your being any American taxpayer, are going towards a lot of really unjust, certainly unchristian things. And there's only so much you can kind of contort yourself before you start grappling with that, or, you ignore it entirely.
Yeah, I think that's really important, trying to make it tangible. And that's what I think history has done for me, seeing, I remember just a couple years ago when the general from Iran was assassinated. We bombed him, and everybody's like, well, I'm glad we got him. Iran's so bad. And I just asked the question. I was like, well, why does Iran hate us? Like, why are we enemies? Like, well, they took hostages back, in whatever, 79 or whenever it was. Yeah. I was like, do you know why? No. Well, you go back to the coup, and then you just start looking at history, and everything's connected. Like you said, with NATO expansion and Russia, or, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, how dare they put missiles in Cuba? Well, we have missiles in Turkey that are right on Russia's border. Of course, they're going to put missiles in Cuba, and Cuba's their own country. Why can't they make decisions for themselves? Why do we have a say in that? So it's tangible. It's very tangible. I think that's a good approach.
Yeah, and to that point about the sovereignty of Cuba or whatever, one of the things that strikes me about the choices of governments in interacting with one another is it's much like in any domestic situation, sovereignty only goes as far as power will allow it. And they being those in power are not really concerned about limiting your sovereignty, challenging it, revoking it when it suits them or when it goes against their stated ends. And so American foreign policy and, generally like this global hegemon that we've built for ourselves, only really appreciates sovereignty or uses it as a catcall for mass murder when it suits them. But, the sovereignty of China or Taiwan, even as it stands with our treaties with those countries, as going back 70 years, doesn't really matter because we still have to, potentially go to war with China over the South China Sea and the islands there. Or the sovereignty of Cuba, as you said, really only extends as far as our own, bodily safety can allow it, which in some respects, I guess is fair if you're thinking in a cold calculus, but none of this stuff is happening in a vacuum. Cuba didn't just decide they'd like to, terrorize the the hearts and minds of Americans with, the prospect of nukes on their borders, but, it came from somewhere, and thinking about that and not just reading headlines and reacting and forgetting what you saw yesterday is an important, I think, primer for getting to where I am.
Yeah, another thing you said resonated with me because my closest friends. So I've got 3 college friends, and 2 of them are are in the Army, and then our next door neighbor back in the States at my parents' house that we're really close to. He's a police officer, and you were talking about how you respect the idea of it, and you really. Yeah, I mean, you can honor them, and talking about the banality of evil and how just it's just everyday people who are kind of carrying out these things that they're not malicious, they're not evil. They went into the army or the police force with good intent, and they've probably done very good things. Probably haven't committed atrocities, but they're cogs in the wheel that allow those sorts of things to happen. And so, it's what you said resonated with me because there is this respect and stuff that I have for what they do, but at the same time, I recognize the machinery that it runs, and that's a difficult thing to hold together.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time for this anecdote, but I just was having a conversation with a buddy I deployed with, who became a cop and is now on a SWAT team in a local town here in Connecticut. And it's like a pretty rough town, crime ridden, and a lot of drugs. And he was telling me about the SWAT raid they did a couple of weeks ago for this murder suspect that they had been tracking for a long time, and knew that the following morning he would be getting on a plane at Hartford Airport and fleeing the country. And so they conducted this SWAT raid. I was arguing against the necessity of these raids with him. And he said, well, this guy's a murderer. He killed this guy. Like, we got to go get him. And it struck me that he never thought, like I said, you can't call the TSA and he's going to take his belt off and put his hands up. Like, we can't peacefully find a way to get this guy. We have to crash down his doors and potentially kill him or anyone else to get our guy. And I think when the machinery exists for the sorts of things that we're talking about, it necessarily is going to be used. And it's one of the big reasons why we didn't want things like a standing army early on in American history, is because when you have a standing army, you have a penchant to use it. And, suddenly, you flash forward a couple hundred years and you've got a hammer and everything's a nail. And it's just, there are solutions to the problems that we think are ailing us. And most of them are things that are going to reduce ultimately the power, scope, and breadth of the state. And so these conversations become, outside the lines of respectable discourse because they don't suit the powerful who use them.
Yeah. That reminds me, I mean, I've heard of this happening in lots of government offices. I know as a teacher, it happened with the school system too, but you get allocated a certain amount of money, and at the end of the year, they're like, all right, well, we've got this money left over. We've got to use it because if we don't use it, they're going to think we don't need it, and then they won't give it to us next year. So we have to kind of justify it by using it. And so that, that idea of the standing army, you have it, you're going to use it, because how else are you going to justify having it?
Yeah. And it's kind of cool, right? Like, if you're the chess player at the local police department, you have this new MRAP, and you've got this gang of guys who trains all the time to crash indoors, and they're all very excited to go out and do their thing, and all this machismo is very much, I think, part of it, and it's disappointing, but it's also, again, like, very tangible. There's plenty of stories in the 50,000 plus SWAT raids that we have conducted in the U.S. every year of, babies getting hurt or maimed or killed. The 10,000 dogs or something that they estimate are being shot by police every year. Like these individual cases probably seem, somehow justifiable to the people that are taking part. But I think once you start grappling with the numbers and the reality of things on the ground, like, and I'm an ER nurse, so if the justification for this stuff is supposed to be something like the drug war, I can tell you, as most people in emergency acute healthcare can tell you, is it's not working. I've seen more corpses related to fentanyl and the crimes related to secondary to the drug market to tell you that it's not working. So maybe we can dial it all back a little bit and figure out a different solution.
Yeah, I think part of that's probably because if I see an MRAP going down the street, or if I know my police department has it, makes me feel safer because I'm not a criminal. Like they're not going to come after me, and right. I know that they're going to go after the bad guys.
And they're cool. You get to bring your kid to the touch truck, and they get to climb around, and it's all very aesthetic and silly in some ways.
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit about freedoms and the idea that military and police kind of protect our freedoms to a certain extent. One of the things that I've struggled with and would love to know now, if you've had any discussions of this being in the military or even post-military, since you're in contact with some friends, I struggle with the idea of rights, especially as a Christian. And I mean, even as an American, this idea of inalienable rights, like inalienable means inalienable, right? And that's tied to our humanity, not tied to our United States citizenship. Yet it seems like as we conduct wars and police operations, that we don't really think that rights are inalienable. The investigation that they did about black sites and things, and the torture that the United States was doing. You take people and you just don't classify them as combatants, and you can take them to some place and you can torture them because they don't have human rights. So I guess my question is, it seems like there's this really big double standard where we talk about fighting for inalienable rights, yet it seems like the way that we get to those inalienable rights for United States citizens is to deny inalienable rights to others. And you mentioned bombing a school bus with kids. I don't know if that was a real example that you were thinking of or what, but I'm sure you can think of some real things that happened. I'd love for you to talk about that kind of discrepancy between U.S. rights versus inalienable human rights.
Yeah, so the school bus example is a real one. It's happened several times. It happened in Syria. It got a little bit of news coverage, but there was I imagine it had to have been targeted and followed fairly closely. Those Predator drones, Reaper drones, they have like high def cameras, and they generally don't just like zoom out somewhere and to the call of they don't generally just come out and just bomb randomly. They do a lot of reconnaissance and stuff, and they use people on the ground to make the calls for when they're going to bomb. So they hit this school bus. I don't understand how that could have been confused. And it's happened in, I think, in Iraq and Syria, certainly, and I'm sure elsewhere. Kindergartens and daycares. I mean, this is sort of the nature of this giant machine. And yeah, I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, the question about human universals really falls away when you're making military decisions, which in some respects, I guess, is necessary if you're conducting a war. It just so happens that our war is sort of ever expanding. Who we are at war with is an ever growing list. And that necessarily means that there's that many more people, the citizens of all of those countries that we add on, that become unpersoned and the unfortunate victims of of this ridiculous machine. It's the only way I can really think about it as in terms of a machine, because it's so soulless and bloated and insane. But I don't think people are making moral calculus at all in the military or in the police. Often, I think they're making decisions based on processes and objectives. And when you're making strictly tactical decisions, strictly strategic decisions, it's very easy to think that you're making an omelet, and sometimes you have to break eggs, and that's just the way things are. And it's unfortunate for, person X or Y, but these are the costs of American freedom, so called.
Yeah. It reminds me of Tolstoy. He talks a little bit about the machinery, and he talks about how you diffuse this responsibility. If I'm the executioner, I'm like, well, I mean, the judge convicted him, or the jury convicted him, the judge sentenced him. His lawyer had an opportunity to defend him. I'm just flipping a switch. I'm just kind of doing my job, and you're able to kind of make your role really minor and something that, isn't a big deal when you can't see the big picture. And I think, have you read by any chance Smedley Butler's "War is a Racket"?
Yeah, okay. It was one of the first big anti-war books I read. So interestingly, just so Smedley Butler is like a legend, obviously, in the Marine Corps, and he's when you're in boot camp in the Marines, you have to yell these. They call them ditties. Like they'll give a call and response thing. So one of their call and responses from the drill instructors was 2 Marines, 2 medals. And you yell Smedley Butler's name, and they do this constantly. But his name reverberates in the culture of the Marine Corps. And when I found out that he had written that, I was genuinely floored. Like, this guy is held up as the standard, and here he is challenging the same war that we read about and are told. We had all these heroic actions with the Marines, the Battle of Belleau Wood and all of this stuff. And it really struck me that, he got a Medal of Honor in World War I, and was tasked afterwards with going around and trying to fundraise for it, and was challenging the very fact that we were in that war. And this is a guy, you can't question the credentials of a guy who's led people in combat enough to have won 2 Medals of Honor, been awarded 2 Medals of Honor. And by all accounts is this perfect example of what it means to be a Marine. And he didn't buy it. He wasn't on board, which is just beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love, if you follow his story after he got out of the military, he wrote War is a Racket with all of that hindsight. And so that's powerful. But then after the war, I think he did what you were kind of talking about at the beginning, where he fought for veterans' rights. He fought for their pensions and that kind of stuff. Like, he respected them, but he hated the machinery, the big picture. And so he was able to kind of divorce those two things and recognize individual people's motivations and where they're at, as compared to the system as a whole. And that's something that, as I talk to people who are in the military, a lot of them, the longer that they're in, the more they get disillusioned with it. And I've heard stories of, them talking about, the higher ups who basically, you have this certain track, you go in, and then you get out and you become a contractor and you make loads and loads of money. And they told me about quite a number of people who were just gaming the system. And it reminded me so much of Smedley Butler. Do you have any anecdotes, or do you have any stories of anything that you've seen or talked with people about, where you have tangible examples of what Smedley Butler observed, but like in modernity?
I don't. As far as the incestuousness of corporate entities in the military, I do know that there was there was always a Honeywell rep anywhere we went because we were, truck drivers, and we had these high-tech weapon systems and these computerized communications that required a bunch of service all the time. And so we would deal with them, and they were often guys who were doing what I was doing 3 years ago, and now they're out making 180 grand or whatever to be there for the same amount of time. But what I had seen was mostly we were on the road a lot. My mission was to secure fuel for fuel lines, fuel supply lines. And so we would drive tractor trailer trucks that were owned by Afghans, owned and operated by Afghans. And then we would just provide security for them. It was a very odd mission, and I think a perfect opportunity to really see just how absurd this whole thing was. It was extremely expensive, and we would lose a lot of fuel. And there's something about seeing gas that's like $98 a gallon or something evaporate at 20,000 gallons a mission all over the sand. It's just so insane to think about. But I think that that incestuous relationship of power, military power, and the corporate interests is generally only seen at the top, and that's these segments in the various hierarchies in the military and government exist, I think, for that reason, to sort of obscure a little bit of the villainy, make it less obvious to those, especially the people on the ground that are carrying out a lot of these things. It's necessary that they have the buy-in to continue conducting whatever the operation is. So if you start questioning the veracity of various claims, or how functional it really is, it doesn't really serve the ultimate ends of power. So I know in the military now, or at least, when we were really involved in a lot of like combat operations in the Middle East, there's an understanding that like no one really gets why we're here. But now that we are, and, we're brothers in arms or whatever, we're doing this for one another and for general safety of our crew. And because it's kind of fun, and we're 20 years old, and they gave us 50 cal machine guns to play with. And it's this sort of postmodern take on the military, which is like, it's all ironic and inauthentic and whatever, it'll make for a good meme or a good profile picture, and I'll make a little bit of money and go to college for free. And, it's a little bit cynical and extremely sad, but I think that's sort of the reality for a lot of people.
Okay. Yeah. I was just going to ask you, is that like something that in retrospect you kind of impose on yourself back then, or do you think that's a really common perspective?
No, I mean, the tropes about like this being either an issue that we don't understand, or, that is like the mission in Afghanistan, right? Or I know some of the guys I deployed with had been on the same group that had gone to Iraq in like 2008, 2009. So if you're deploying to Iraq in 2009, you fully understand that you don't understand what it is that we're doing there. Except that like Saddam's gone now, and there's still people shooting at us. And, term like Sunni and Shia don't really mean a whole lot, but they're Arab and different looking and speak a different language, and they're the stated bad guy. And so, we'll do what we have to do. When I got to Afghanistan, we had already been there for 11 years, 10 years. I'd gotten there in 2011. And we had this undulation of military action because early on, Afghanistan was the focus. That's where bin Laden was. Bin Laden's gone. We kind of focused more on Iraq, and now we're back. I was part of the Obama surge. And so we don't quite get what we're supposed to do here, except that we're going to dominate this country. And the perspective of riding around in a multi-million-dollar high-tech vehicle past shepherds with sheep, past people who don't have electricity, whose running water comes from a giant, plastic tank that the little community utilizes, people who ride on motorcycles, 7 people in a family all at once, and who draw water from a well with a bucket. It's really not hard to see the absurdity of the contrast between, us and the enemy, and not quite understand what it is that we're supposed to be doing here, what mission we're supposed to achieve. It certainly couldn't be hearts and minds like we were told, because they certainly don't seem to like us very much. And nothing we're doing is to win hearts or minds. So I think everyone's very acutely aware, who's operating on the ground, especially if you're outside the base and dealing with locals, or part of a combat mission. It's impossible not to see.
Yeah, so you're talking about multi-million-dollar vehicles and losing 20,000 gallons of gasoline. That's a lot of money. And talking about just doing your taxes, it makes me think, when I do my taxes every year now, I think about, man, like 50%, whatever it is, of this is going to fund something that I wholeheartedly don't believe in. And that's just the war part. I'm sure there are lots of other things I don't believe in that my money goes towards. But it's sold to us as being, well, that's, part of what you do because you're an American citizen. You live under the Constitution, under this law. And it reminds me, I heard you talking in one of your interviews about Lysander Spooner and his work, No Treason. So I'd love for you to, talking about taxes and military spending and waste and all that stuff, but us being sold that it's kind of an obligation that we have. I'd love for you to kind of just give a little introduction to Spooner's No Treason, and kind of tie that into what we've been talking about.
Yeah. So Spooner wrote this short piece, 60 pages or so, called, I think after the fact, titled No Treason, which was, he was a lawyer, an American lawyer, and an abolitionist back when it, took real guts to be an abolitionist, who kind of arrived to the conclusion that the Constitution was not binding for the contemporary American citizens of the middle 19th century, because most of the people who had signed it had been long dead, and it was something that you couldn't argue would be still controlling us today if consent, which was his underlying principle, really couldn't be understood to be given by the individuals of the day, or especially those who weren't voting, either because they didn't have the right, which was the vast majority, or because they chose not to. And so he challenges all the various presuppositions that we learn in grade school about the Constitution and the compact that it's supposed to provide. And he talks specifically in the beginning, actually early on, about taxation and its justice as it stands. Like, the arguments for taxation really don't hold up. And I don't believe he's a Christian. He never really makes any mention of a spiritual angle. So again, he's making a secular sort of pragmatic argument against the use of power by elites to maintain a sphere of influence over the populace, to fleece them for their tax dollars, and to, in his time, conduct this institution of slavery, or, soon after to fight a civil war that he saw as wholly unnecessary and unjust, because the nature of our union was sort of built on false pretenses. And so, it's a really interesting piece, how it connects here, I guess, to our conversation about like power in the military, and especially with Christian anarchism. I think, we really have to think as Christians about our interactions with the world around us, because there's the temporal space, right? The worldly things that we can touch and feel and see, and then there's this spiritual realm and the kingdom of God that we were promised, and to participate, or worse, to be like an excited participant, an active, patriotic participant in this government and power, is to sort of fly right in the face of the stated ends of God and of Christ, and what Christ commanded of his followers, and to have that built in to your culture should give a lot of Christians immediate pause when they think about things like patriotism. But instead, we have a culture of American evangelical Christians, certainly, of hyper patriotic, avid military support, all of the things, happy to sort of hitch their wagon first to the red, white, and blue, and then to Christianity. And I think it's one of the more depressing things about the church right now, is that this connection with the state is so individualized and so heartfelt. It seems to be the primary thought in most American Christians' minds is their relationship with the state, and not their relationship with the promised kingdom of God.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the hard things in terms of being a Christian, is that I think this impact. I'm not saying that, of course, atheists and secular humanists have emotions and feel for other people, but it feels like, because of my view of the image of God, like this whole issue just strikes me at a fundamentally different level, like just the devastation and despair of what we're doing to the world, and the systems that we're kind of enslaved to. But I think, one thing that I would want to emphasize here, and maybe make this kind of the last talking point, is that I think a lot of times people think that whether you're pacifist or anti-war or anarchist, I think a lot of times people view that as a negative sort of thing, like a critical sort of thing, like you're just trying to jab at people and criticize them for what they're doing. But I just, like 2 years ago, I started reading some books on moral injury. I'm not sure if you've heard of that term, but it seems like it's a relatively new field, at least the classification of it. But it's basically talking about how soldiers are injured morally when they come back. And part of that was there's this guy named David Grossman. He wrote a book on killing. And I thought his book was good. He's an interesting guy, but at least his one piece of work was really good. And talking about different studies where they realized that it wasn't even, a lot of times we think, well, PTSD and all this stuff that comes from people facing death, like it's fear. But he talked about these studies that they did in like World War II, where the soldiers would have like increased rates of psychoses, whereas like people who were in London or bombed out places where they were having air raids all the time, like they didn't have a significantly increased rate of psychoses. So they're like, well, it's not necessarily just a fear that something's going to happen to me. There's something more that's causing these psychoses. And so the hypothesis was, well, it's because there's this, we don't think that people are made to kill each other. Like that's not part of who we are. So you have to basically tear the moral fabric of a person to train them to kill somebody else and to put them in situations where daily they're thinking, am I going to kill that guy? Am I going to kill somebody? And so at least I don't know, what research has been done since then, but there's a lot on moral injury that's just really interesting. Read one book that's like a book of, I think, like 10 or 15 essays from people who were in battle. And the one struck me because this person has PTSD, but they weren't in combat. Like, they talks about that the situation that impacted him was when they went into like this villager's house, and basically, he saw the look of fear on his face for his kids and his family and all this other stuff. And he was morally injured, not because of any situation that he was in to fear for his life, but because of the moral fabric that he had to tear in himself. So I would, I don't know if you have any stories or insights into what people go through in terms of moral injury and the things that are done to them. But I think it's a really important place to end, not just to kind of pick at the system, but to also recognize, some areas that we want to build up and kind of repair and help people.
Yeah. So your initial point, I think, is a really important one, which is you can't have a politics of negation. And I for the life of me, as you were talking, I couldn't place where I had recently read about this, but some newsletter somewhere was talking about this issue of politics of negation and how anarchism, particularly leftist anarchism, but maybe anarchism in general, can exist in this form where it's just, the anti, I'm anti-war, I'm anti-state, I'm anti-violence, whatever. And instead of offering alternatives or, really putting up a functional secondary parallel thing, it's just a matter of putting down the current thing, which is really not a difficult thing to do. So the issue of anti-war maybe is better served as a pro-peace agenda, and that moral injury and the way that all ties in is that I think you're right. A lot of veterans, especially of the global war on terror, have extremely high suicide rates, as they did with Vietnam. And these are two big military actions where the buy-in, so-called, of the individual participants is really kind of hard to come by. And so if I have to go to a foreign place, get shot at and bombed, and then I simultaneously have to take a human life, and I don't quite understand why. I don't see that person as a genuine threat or enemy. That often flowers; those seeds often flower into something really destructive later on, which is why people have really high rates of divorce and alcoholism and, again, suicide, is because I think they're taking part in something that's really unjust. There was a piece in the New York Times just this week about a drone operator who, because they're not classified as combatants, they don't really go through any of the same psychological reviews and decompression times and all that stuff. And they're asked to go on high def camera and kill people like a video game. And he really struggled with that. And I think, the point of the piece was really inane. It was basically saying, we need to classify these people as combatants so they could get more mental health treatment. And it's like, well, maybe we should just dismantle all of the various, institutions that are perpetrating these things and having these people act as, participants in bombing various countries all over the world. Maybe that's the thing that we should focus on. The David Grossman book is wonderful. I read it while I was in the Marines, right before one of my early schools. I think it was part of the recommended reading list, and it talks a lot about how you train an individual Western American, these cosmopolitan, educated people to do something so barbarous. And it's very streamlined and really quite amazing. Every aspect of your training has this underlying focus on killing and death. So like when you respond, oftentimes to respond, you'll be saying kill, and it'll be 100 guys yelling kill as like an affirmative to whatever they're being told. And when you're in it, it just seems like, yeah, this is what we do. This is the culture. You yell kill. And, but every aspect down to that, mundane of a detail is supposed to prepare you to pull the trigger when the time comes. And the question is not so that you can feel better about it or it's easier for you morally. It's that so in the moment, you won't hesitate and that you'll do the thing that you have to do, overcoming your innate aversion to, killing another human being, which exists no matter how much you dislike that other person. Even if you're fully justified and they did something terrible to a loved one or whatever, there's a human element that makes you not want to do that, not want to kill. The pro-peace, nonviolent position is the natural one. And I mean, natural in the sense that you and I would think, which is like our nature as image bearers of God. Because all human beings are. That's not something that we get to draw a border around, and then those people inside the border, outside the border, are not image bearers. And it's an important thing for Christians to talk about and wrestle with explicitly, and something that I think churches should be, especially in the West, who are the major dominant force in the world right now, is how we think about violence and how we as Christians are to participate with that, to consent when it's asked and maybe even when it's not, and functional ways that we can be pulling away from this organization instead of being so happy to be part of it, because it's one of the more heartbreaking things about my even personal experience with church is just how much of the military and police culture has pervaded and comes to kind of define the church body. And it's this overwhelming irony for me that the same group of people who will talk about Jesus and his death and resurrection, as we had just celebrated last weekend, will be wearing clothes or hats, or working in occupations that are the very same organizations that would have chased down and killed Messianic Jews, Jesus himself, the early disciples of the church. It was the same powers that early Christians wrestled with, and really got, I think, a lot of their credibility and resolve from fighting against, are now we hand in hand with the church, which it's just amazing to me that that's where we've landed. But I hope that's not where we end.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a good place to end. End this discussion, though, because you're talking about negative politics, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Stanley Hauerwas's work, but the thing that he says is that the church is the Christian politic, and so I think as a Christian anarchist, my goal isn't the individual. Like I believe in individual freedom, and I think that the state's a huge problem. But my positive politic is the church, like communities of peace that model peace, that don't compromise, that aren't cogs in a wheel, but they do the right thing because it's the right thing, regardless of what some authority tells them to do. They obey God rather than men, and they're communities that are generous and that disciple one another. And think that's an important positive ethic, not only for the world, but also for people who are returning from war who are Christians, because Christians compose a lot of the military. And I think the one beautiful thing about going into a senseless war is that it might wake some people up. And when they do wake up, I think that the church needs to be there to offer that positive, the positive politic. But unfortunately, like you said, a lot of American Christianity is hand in hand with the government and doesn't have anything to offer.
Yeah, and it's best demonstrated by the military clergy and the entire organization of like the faithful amongst the military. If you want to see the most rotted, unironic corpse of Christianity, just go to a military on-base church somewhere and listen to a sermon where they contort scripture to justify anything. And it's one of the things that really gets me pretty heated at this point in my intellectual walk, because these are people that are being relied upon for spiritual guidance, and instead are really just explicit water carriers for regime. And so, I think you're doing a great thing here. And any Christian who's really working to try to spread the gospel in light of the peaceful proclamations of Jesus, not despite it, are really doing God's work. And I think it's so important because, unfortunately, it's the minority voice for Western Christianity anyway, and breaking that, I think, is a difficult task. But I don't think it's for people who are truly faithful to God and to Scripture. I think that the argument can be made. It's just a matter of finding where that wedge issue is for them and hammering it, because I think it has to be done. I think it's one of the more important things for us as contemporary Christians to figure out, to resolve.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.